Welcome to the dynamics of everyday life, where we demystify some tricky concepts and get to know ourselves a little bit better. Welcome back to the show, everyone. It feels a bit like we're getting back to normal business today after the run of the 100th and the birthday episodes. In between all that, the podcast also turned 2 years old, but there is only so much you can do with special episodes before it all starts getting a bit much, so it does feel a bit like we're settling back into the groove. And when I first started scripting this episode, I wrote that we were returning to the more mundane topics of everyday life. And then I had to have a word with myself. I may be many things, but mundane I am not. I will forgive a lot of things in life, but blandness, absolutely not. Anyway, I slightly digress. Today's topic. Picture the scene. You're in a group of people talking about your recent holiday to Tenerife. Did you enjoy it? Says one person. How was the weather? Says another. Tenerife? Says someone else. That's nothing. I've been to Elevenerife. Now, obviously, that isn't a real place. But we all know exactly what it means. It's the moment when an ordinary conversation just starts to become a competition without you ever agreeing to take part. We've all got examples of this. You say you're tired. They're exhausted. You've had a busy week. They haven't stopped all month. Your child didn't sleep. Their child hasn't slept since before the pandemic. Welcome to Elevenerife. Now, Elevenerife isn't really about travel stories or busy weeks, no matter what it feels like at the time. It's about one-upmanship. That subtle shift where someone shares something and another person immediately raises the stakes. And once that happens, something quite important disappears. The original person. Their story. Because the conversation has stopped being about listening and it's subtly shifted gears into outdoing. What started as someone talking about their lovely trip to the Canary Islands has been trampled all over by someone else wanting to be better, to have done more, to somehow have the upper hand. So why do we do this? Because, if we're honest, it's not a particularly nice thing to do. And I suspect that if we saw someone else doing it, we'd be slightly horrified. But, in reality, most of us have probably done this ourselves at some point. Now, there are a few things going on here. First of all, there's the need to be seen. When someone else shares something, a little part of us thinks, yes, but what about me? And in our attempt not to become irrelevant in the conversation, we make what we say a little bigger, a little bolder, a little more impressive than the other person's contribution. We might think we're coming across well. But, in reality, we probably just look a bit insensitive. Possibly a bit narcissistic. What we're actually revealing is a small moment of fragility, an inability to let someone else have the spotlight for a moment. Now, if you're recognising that this is something you occasionally do, don't beat yourself up too much. Comparison, whilst famously the thief of joy, is also deeply human. We are constantly measuring ourselves against other people, both consciously and unconsciously. And when we start to feel that we might be lacking in some area, we instinctively look for ways to restore the balance. So, we escalate the story. Sometimes that means exaggerating. Sometimes it simply means jumping in too quickly with our own experience. Maybe we really have been to Elevenerife, but instead of pausing and listening to the person speaking, we feel an urgent need to make sure our experience is also heard. Because we don't want to come out of the comparison looking like we've somehow lost. The irony, of course, being that if we'd just stayed quiet and listened, we would almost certainly come across far better than when we start competing. Listening properly means staying with someone else's reality. And that can actually feel surprisingly uncomfortable. There's a reason it takes time to become a coach or a therapist. You have to learn how to listen. And I mean really listen. Not just wait for the gapping in the conversation so you can jump in with your own story. That takes practice. And most people haven't had training in how to do that. So when conversations start touching something a little vulnerable, we instinctively move the spotlight back to somewhere safer. Ourselves. A familiar territory. A part of the conversation that we can control. Sometimes what's happening in these moments is that we start to feel like we're disappearing in the conversation. And the escalation becomes a way of making sure that our experience still matters. So, we inflate the story. We raise the stakes. We make it just a little bit bigger. But in doing that, we unintentionally invalidate the other person. And instead of creating connection, we actually create distance. Someone says that they stayed in a particular resort in Tenerife, and we reply with, "Oh yes, we've been there, but we stayed in this amazing villa further up the coast." A moment that could have been shared suddenly becomes a moment of quiet division. The truth is that most of us have visited Elevenerife, at least occasionally, probably without even noticing. It tends to show up in situations where there's a bit of anxiety floating around. Christmas parties where we don't know everyone. Social gatherings. And the big one, the school gates. Moments where we're slightly unsure of ourselves and grasping around for something that will help us feel more secure. Think about those moments where you've jumped in with something bigger than someone else's story. And halfway through your sentence you suddenly realise, no, why am I doing this? Why am I trying to outdo this person? Because most of the time, when someone tells us something about their life, they're not asking for a bigger story. They're asking to be heard. And the simplest response is often the one that keeps the conversation out of Elevenerife. Just staying with what the other person said. Elevenerife isn't a real place, but if you start listening for it, you'll hear people travelling there all the time. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Dynamics of Everyday Life. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. As well as producing this podcast, The Dynamics of Everyday Life has lots more psychodynamic fun going on, and you can find out more at dynamicsofeveryday.life.